Frank Miller sat at his usual corner table in the Sunrise Diner. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the worn tabletop. At 85 years old, Frank moved a bit slower these days, but his posture remained straight, a habit formed during his years as a Marine. 3 tours in Vietnam had left their mark on him, both the visible scars on his weathered hands and the invisible ones he carried inside. "More coffee, Frank?" Doris asked, already tilting, the pot toward his mug. "Please," Frank said with a nod. Doris had been serving him breakfast every Tuesday morning for the past decade. She knew his order by heart. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, no butter. "How's that grandson of yours doing? Still playing baseball?" Frank asked. Doris smiled, crow's feet crinkling at the corners of her eyes. "Made the varsity team last week. Joe and I are going to his first game on Friday. That boy has a good arm. Gets it from his grandmother," Frank said with a wink. The television mounted. In the corner played the morning news. A reporter stood in front of a massive launch facility, talking excitedly about humanity's newest space colony expedition. Frank watched with interest. His son Jack worked up there somewhere, though exactly what he did remained classified. Something to do with defense systems for the new colonies. The peaceful morning shattered when the door to the diner banged open. 5 men in leather jackets strode in, their boots heavy on the linoleum floor. Patches on their backs identified them as the Road Demons. The lead man, tall with a thick beard and tattoos crawling up his neck, scanned the diner with cold eyes. "Hey," he shouted toward the counter. "Someone gonna take our order or what?" Doris, who had been refilling another customer's coffee, flinched at his tone. "Be right with you, sir. Please take any open table." The bearded man grunted and led his group to a large booth. They sprawled across the seats, laughing loudly and swearing as they discussed their ride from the neighboring county. Frank frowned as their voices grew louder. A young mother at a nearby table was trying to quiet her upset child, clearly uncomfortable with the biker's language. One of the men noticed Frank watching them. He nudged the bearded leader. "Hey, Keith, I think Grandpa over there has a problem with us." Keith Dawson turned his gaze to Frank. "Something on your mind, old-timer?" Frank set down his coffee cup. "Nothing worth mentioning. Just wondering if you boys might watch your language. There are families present." A tense silence fell over the diner. The other customers looked down at their plates, suddenly finding their breakfast incredibly interesting. Keith stood up slowly and walked over to Frank's table. He was at least 6'3" with massive shoulders and arms covered in faded tattoos. He loomed over the seated veteran. "You telling me how to talk?" Keith asked, his voice dangerously soft. Frank met his gaze steadily. "Just suggesting a bit of courtesy, that's all." "Courtesy?" Keith repeated with a mocking laugh. "Who do you think you are?" "Just a fellow customer enjoying his breakfast," Frank replied calmly. Years of combat had taught him not to show fear, even when fear was the appropriate response. Keith leaned down, placing his knuckles on the table. "Let me tell you something, Grandpa. I don't take suggestions from anyone, especially not some dried-up old man who needs to mind his own business." Frank sighed. "Son, I've met men like you my whole life, bullies who mistake volume for importance. Why don't you go back to your table, enjoy your meal, and let the rest of us enjoy ours?" Something dangerous flashed in Keith's eyes. "Did you just call me a bully?" "If the shoe fits," Frank said, taking another sip of his coffee. The other bikers had stood up now, forming a loose semicircle around Frank's table. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the child had stopped crying, sensing the tension in the air. "You know what?" Keith said, straightening up. "I think you need to learn some respect." Frank set down his mug. "I learned respect in the jungles of Vietnam, son. Not sure where you learned yours." Keith's face darkened. "Vietnam? So what? You're some kind of war hero? Want a medal for something that happened 50 years ago?" Frank remained silent, his eyes never leaving Keith's face. "I asked you a question, old man," Keith growled, leaning in closer. "And I chose not to answer it," Frank replied. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my breakfast in peace. As Frank reached for his coffee mug again, Keith knocked it from his hand. Hot coffee splashed across the table and onto Frank's lap. He winced but made no sound. Peace? You want peace? Keith snarled. How's this for peace? The punch came fast. Faster than an 85-year-old man could dodge, even one with combat training. Keith's fist connected with Frank's jaw, snapping his head back and toppling him from his chair. Frank hit the floor hard, a small groan escaping his lips as pain shot through his hip. His vision blurred and he tasted blood in his mouth. Next time, mind your own business. Keith spat, looking down at the fallen veteran. The other bikers laughed, high-fiving their leader as they turned to leave. They hadn't even waited for their food. Hey, Doris shouted, rushing to Frank's side. You can't do that. I'm calling the police. Keith turned at the door, a smirk on his face. Go ahead, lady. By the time they get here, we'll be long gone. And who's going to believe an old man didn't just fall out of his chair? The bikers left, the roar of their motorcycles thundering through the parking lot moments later. Doris helped Frank to a sitting position, pressing a clean napkin to his bleeding lip. Oh, Frank, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? We need to get you to a hospital. I'm fine, Frank insisted, though he winced when he tried to move his leg. Just help me up. I'm calling an ambulance, one of the other customers said, already dialing. On his phone. And the police, added another. Doris looked at Frank with worry in her eyes. Is there someone I should call for you? Your daughter, maybe? Frank shook his head slowly. No, not her. She's in Seattle with the grandkids. He paused, reaching into his pocket with shaking hands. He pulled out an old flip phone and handed it to Doris. But you can call my son. He's in my contacts. Just look for Jack. As Doris took the phone, Frank added quietly, Tell him exactly what happened. He'll want to know. Doris nodded and stepped away to make the call while the other customers helped Frank to a chair. Outside, the bikers' motorcycles could still be heard in the distance, growing fainter as they sped away. What they didn't know was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because Frank Miller wasn't just any 85-year-old veteran, and his son Jack wasn't just any soldier. In exactly 30 minutes, they would learn the meaning of consequences. Colonel Jack Miller stood in the command center of the orbital defense platform, Liberty Shield, his eyes fixed on the massive viewing screen that displayed Earth below. At 47, Jack had the same strong jawline as his father, the same steady gaze that could make new recruits stand straighter without saying a word. 25 years in the military had earned him command of humanity's most advanced defensive installation. Colonel, the alien signal from Neptune shows the same pattern as yesterday, Lieutenant Greg Porter reported, sliding a data tablet across the briefing table. Still no translation breakthrough. Jack nodded, studying the waveform patterns on the screen. The mysterious signal had first been detected 3 weeks ago, sending the defense community into high alert. As commander of the 1st Special Orbital Defense Unit, Jack was responsible for humanity's first line of protection against any potential threat. Continue monitoring and increase sensor sweep radius by another 1,000,000 kilometers, Jack ordered. I want to know if anything larger than a basketball approaches our system. Yes, sir, Greg replied, turning to relay the commands to his team. Major Samantha Wright approached with another report. Sir, the new photon cannons passed all diagnostics. They're online and operational. Jack allowed himself a small smile. Good work, Sam. Those cannons... The communication panel on his wrist beeped, interrupting him. Jack frowned. This was his personal line, used only for family emergencies. His father was the only one who had this direct number. Excuse me, he said to his officers, stepping away from the briefing table. He tapped the panel. Miller. Hello, is this Jack? The voice was female, older, and clearly upset. Jack's body tensed. This wasn't his father. Yes, this is Colonel Miller. Who am I speaking with? This is Doris, from the Sunrise Diner. I'm a friend of your father's, Jack. Something terrible has happened. The command center continued its normal operations around him, but for Jack, the world narrowed to the voice coming through his communicator. Doris explained what had happened, the bikers, the confrontation, the punch that had sent his father to the floor. How badly is he hurt? Jack asked, his voice controlled despite the anger building inside him. The paramedics are checking him now. His lip is bleeding and he's having trouble with his hip. They're taking him to County General Hospital. Jack glanced at the wall chronometer. I'll be there in 30 minutes. 30 minutes? But you're stationed somewhere overseas, aren't you? Frank never said exactly. 30 minutes, Jack repeated firmly. Please stay with him until I arrive. He ended the call and stood motionless for a moment, his mind racing. Then he turned sharply and walked back to the briefing table. Major Wright, Lieutenant Porter with me, he ordered, already moving toward the exit. They followed without question, catching up in the corridor. Sir? Samantha asked. My father has been assaulted. I'm going planetside. You're both coming with... Eh? Greg looked confused. Both of us? Sir, with all due respect, is that necessary for a personal matter? Jack stopped walking and turned to face them. My father is an 85-year-old Marine veteran who served 3 tours in Vietnam. He was just attacked by a group of bikers who thought they could punch an old man and face no consequences. So yes, Lieutenant, I consider this necessary. He resumed walking, his pace brisk. Contact Strike Team Alpha. Full tactical gear. Non-lethal. Weapons only. Samantha's eyes widened. Strike Team Alpha? Sir, mobilizing a strike team for a personal matter is against regulations. Jack entered the elevator that would take them to the hangar bay. I'm not going as a UDF officer. I'm going as a son. Anyone who wants to file a complaint can do so after we return. The elevator doors closed. When they opened again, they were in the massive hangar bay where spacecraft of various sizes were docked in neat rows. Jack headed straight for the Falcon, a sleek dropship designed for rapid deployment to Earth. As they walked, Jack tapped his communication panel again. This is Colonel Miller. Prepare the Falcon for immediate launch. Destination: County General Hospital landing pad, Millville, United States. Then have ground transport ready for a secondary location to be determined en route. Yes, sir, came the immediate response. Within 10 minutes, Strike Team Alpha, 12 of the most elite soldiers in the United Defense Force, had assembled in the hangar bay. They wore standard-issue combat suits with UDF insignia removed. Each carried non-lethal but advanced weaponry, sonic disruptors, neural tasers, and tactical restraint gear. Captain Alan Rodriguez, the team leader, approached Jack. Strike Team, Alpha reporting as ordered, sir. The men are asking about the mission parameters. Jack looked at the assembled soldiers. These weren't just any troops. They were specialists trained for zero-gravity combat and emergency operations on the space colonies. Each had been hand-selected by Jack himself. Men, Jack said, his voice carrying across the hangar bay. This is not an official UDF operation. I'm asking for volunteers only. My father, a Marine veteran, was assaulted today by a gang of bikers. We're going to pay them a visit. There was a moment of silence. Then Captain Rodriguez stepped forward. Your father is a veteran, sir. That makes this a matter of honor. Strike Team Alpha volunteers. The other soldiers nodded in agreement. Jack felt a swell of pride. Thank you. Our mission is simple. Locate the perpetrators, detain them, and turn them over to local authorities. No excessive force. We're soldiers, not thugs. He turned to Samantha. Major Wright, you'll coordinate from the dropship and handle any communication with local law enforcement. Let's be clear. This is a case of citizens making a legal arrest following an assault. The fact that we happen to be military personnel is incidental. Samantha's lips twitched into something almost like a smile. Of course, sir. Just citizens doing their civic duty. I'll prepare the necessary documentation. Lieutenant Porter had been working on his data tablet. He looked up. Sir, I've traced the location of a biker gang called the Road Demons to a compound 15 miles outside of Millville. Satellite imagery shows approximately 20 motorcycles on the property. Jack nodded. That's our target. Let's move out. As they boarded the Falcon, Jack felt the familiar pre-mission tension in his muscles. But this was different. This was personal. He thought of his father, a man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had raised Jack alone after his mother died, who had taught him everything about honor and duty. The Falcon's engines roared to life. In the pilot's seat, Jack gripped the controls. "Hangar control, this is Falcon requesting emergency departure clearance." "Clearance granted, Colonel. Bay doors opening now." As the massive hangar doors slid apart, revealing the blackness of space and the blue curve of Earth below, Jack made a silent promise to his father. 28 minutes later, they would enter the atmosphere over Millville. And Keith Dawson was about to learn what happened when you punched the wrong veteran. The Road Demons Motorcycle Club compound sat on 5 acres of land outside Millville. A chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded a collection of run-down buildings. The main structure was a converted warehouse with a large garage attached. To one side, several smaller cabins dotted the property. Beer bottles and trash littered the dirt yard where motorcycles were parked in uneven rows. Keith Dawson sat on a weathered picnic table, drinking his 3rd beer of the morning. Around him, his fellow bikers laughed and celebrated. "Man, you should have seen that old guy's face when you decked him," said Pete, Keith's right-hand man. "Priceless." Keith grinned, tilting his beer bottle toward Pete in a mock toast. "Probably the most excitement he's had since Vietnam." The bikers laughed again, passing around a bottle of whiskey that someone had opened. "Hey, you think that waitress really called the cops?" asked a newer member, looking nervously over his shoulder. Keith snorted. "Who cares if she did? Local sheriff knows better than to mess with us. Besides, we didn't do nothing wrong. Old man was disrespecting us. He fell. That's all the sheriff needs to know." In the back of the compound, a biker named Ray worked on his motorcycle. Unlike the others, he wasn't celebrating. Ray had served 4 years in the Army before being discharged. He hadn't liked the way Keith had treated the old veteran, but he knew better than to say anything. "You didn't last long in the Road Demons," by questioning Keith Dawson. Ray looked up at the sound of engines, expecting to see more club members arriving. Instead, he saw something that made him drop his wrench. "What the hell?" he muttered. In the sky above Millville, the Falcon dropship cut through the clouds. Its sleek black shape was unlike any aircraft most of the townspeople had ever seen. People stopped on the sidewalks, pointing upward and taking pictures with their phones. Inside the cockpit, Jack Miller guided the craft toward the hospital landing pad. His face was set in a grim expression as he listened to the update from Major Wright. "Local police confirm the bikers are a group called the Road Demons," Samantha reported. "They've had multiple run-ins with law enforcement, but nothing that stuck. Their compound is located here." She sent the coordinates to Jack's display. "What about my father?" Jack asked. "Hospital reports he has a split lip, bruising to his jaw, and he may have re-injured his hip from the fall. Nothing life-threatening." Jack nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Good. Lieutenant Porter, what's the status on our ground?" "Transport?" Greg checked his tablet. 2 civilian SUVs will be waiting at the hospital, unmarked, tinted windows as requested. "Perfect." Jack began the landing sequence as the hospital came into view. "Captain Rodriguez, have the team ready to move the moment we touch down." The Falcon settled onto the hospital's helipad with barely a sound. Its advanced engines quieter than any standard helicopter. As the rear hatch opened, medical staff stared in amazement at the military craft. Jack was the first one out, still in his UDF uniform. He moved quickly toward the hospital entrance, Samantha and Greg flanking him. Behind them, Strike Team Alpha filed out in an orderly line, their combat gear drawing stares from everyone they passed. At the reception desk, a startled nurse looked up at Jack. "Can I help you?" "Frank Miller. He was brought in about 20 minutes ago. Assault victim." The nurse blinked, her eyes moving from Jack to the soldiers behind him. "Are you family?" "I'm his son, Colonel Jack Miller, United Defense Force." Recognition dawned on the nurse's face. "Oh yes, of course, Mr. Miller is in exam room 3. The doctor is with him now." Jack turned to Captain Rodriguez. "Get the team to the vehicles. I'll join you in 5 minutes." Rodriguez saluted. Yes, sir. As the strike team moved out, Jack, Samantha, and Greg headed for exam room 3. They found Frank sitting on an examination table while a doctor wrapped his ribs. Just a precaution, the doctor was saying. I don't think they're broken, but at your age, Dad, Jack said from the doorway. Frank looked up, his face breaking, into a smile despite his split lip. Jack, well, that was quick. Didn't expect to see you for at least a day. Jack moved to his father's side, carefully embracing him. New transport. How are you feeling? Like I got punched by a man half my age, Frank replied with a wry smile, which coincidentally is exactly what happened. The doctor stepped back, his eyes wide as he looked between Frank and Jack, then at the 2 officers in the doorway. I'll, give you some privacy. After the doctor left, Frank raised an eyebrow at his son. So, you brought the cavalry, See? Just a few friends who wanted to make sure you're okay. Frank's eyes narrowed. Jack, what are you planning? Jack's face remained neutral. Just going to have a chat with the gentleman who assaulted you. A chat, Frank repeated. With a strike team. They're just there to make sure the conversation stays civil. Frank sighed. Son, I appreciate the thought, but this isn't necessary. The sheriff won't do anything, Jack finished. Dad, these men assaulted a veteran in public and walked away laughing. That doesn't sit right with me. Frank studied his son's face. After a moment, he nodded slowly. Just remember what I taught you. Being the strongest man in the room means you have the most responsibility to show restraint. Jack squeezed his father's shoulder gently. I remember. He turned to Samantha. Major Wright will stay with you while I'm gone. Samantha stepped forward. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Miller. Your son speaks highly of you. Frank smiled at her. Call me Frank. And I hope he's told you only the good parts. Outside the hospital, 2 black SUVs waited with engines running. Strike Team Alpha had already loaded their gear and taken positions. Jack climbed into the lead vehicle next to Captain Rodriguez. Everyone clear on the mission parameters? Jack asked. Rodriguez nodded. Crystal clear, sir. Detain and deliver. To local authorities. No excessive force. Good. Let's move out. As the SUVs pulled away from the hospital, word was already spreading through Millville. People lined the streets watching the vehicles pass. Some were recording videos on their phones. Others were calling friends. You won't believe what's happening. In the compound, Ray the biker burst into the main building, his face pale. Keith, we got a problem. Keith looked up from his card game, annoyed. What now? I just got a call from Bill at the gas station. Said some kind of military ship just landed at the hospital, and a bunch of soldiers got out. They're heading this way. The other bikers laughed, but Keith frowned. Military? What are you talking about? Ray's voice shook slightly. Bill said they're in some kind of advanced gear he's never seen before, led by an officer. And get this, they're asking about the road demons. The laughter died. Keith stood slowly. That's impossible. Why would the military care about some old man? An older biker named Hank, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. What was the old guy's name, Keith? The one you hit? Keith shrugged. Don't know. Didn't ask for his ID while I was punching him. Someone at the diner called him Frank. Pete offered, Hank's face drained of color. Frank? Older guy, white hair, still sits straight like he's at attention? That was Frank Miller, wasn't it? Keith turned to Hank. Who cares what his name is? We care, Hank said quietly. Because if that's Frank Miller, then we're all in deep trouble. His son is Colonel Jack Miller. Commands the Orbital Defense Platform. A heavy silence fell over the room. In the distance, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching the compound gate. The 2 black SUVs stopped 50 yards from the compound's main gate. Jack stepped out, surveying the property through high-tech binoculars. He could see movement inside as the bikers scrambled to positions. 12 motorcycles approximately, 15 to 20 men, Jack reported to his team. Lieutenant Porter, status on local law enforcement? Greg checked his tablet. Sheriff has been notified we're making a citizen's arrest. He's sending 2 deputies, but they're 20 minutes. Out, Jack nodded. That gives us plenty of time. He turned to Captain Rodriguez. Deploy the team in standard containment formation. I want all exits covered. Rodriguez relayed the orders through his communications device. The strike team moved with practiced efficiency, spreading out to surround the compound. Each soldier carried non-lethal weapons and wore body armor far more advanced than anything available to civilians. Inside the main building, panic had set in. Keith paced back and forth, occasionally peering out through the dirty windows. "This is crazy," he shouted. "Why would the military care about one old man?" Hank, the older biker who had recognized Frank's name, stood against the wall with his arms crossed. "I told you, Frank Miller isn't just any old man. He's a legend. 3 tours in Vietnam, Silver Star recipient. And his son isn't just any officer." Then, "What do we do?" asked Pete, Keith's right-hand man. "We could run for it," suggested another biker. "There's the back trail through the woods." Keith nodded. "Yeah, they can't catch all of us." "Bad idea," Hank said quietly. "These aren't regular soldiers." Outside, Jack lifted a military-grade megaphone to his mouth. "Attention road demons. This is Colonel Jack Miller of the United Defense Force. Keith Dawson, earlier today you assaulted an 85-year-old man at the Sunrise Diner. That man was Frank Miller, my father. We are here to place you under citizen's arrest and deliver you to local authorities." Inside, Keith's face paled. "This is insane. It was just a punch," Jack continued, his voice carrying clearly across the compound. "You have exactly 1 minute to send out Keith Dawson. Anyone who interferes will be detained as an accomplice. Anyone who cooperates will be treated fairly." The bikers looked at each other, then at Keith. No one spoke. Jack lowered the megaphone and turned to his team. "They're not going to make this easy. Lieutenant Porter, activate the surveillance drones." Greg tapped commands into his tablet. 4 small drones, each the size of a dinner plate, lifted from one of the SUVs and flew silently over the compound. Their advanced cameras provided real-time images to Greg's tablet. "I count 18 men inside," Greg reported. "Most are in the main building, but 3 are trying to reach the motorcycles in the back." Jack nodded. "Captain Rodriguez, take Team 2 and secure those motorcycles. No one leaves." Rodriguez signaled to 6 of his men, who moved swiftly around the perimeter of the compound. Jack watched as they easily scaled the chain-link fence and dropped to the other side. Inside, Ray looked out a back window and swore. "They're already inside the fence. How did they move so fast?" Keith grabbed a shotgun from a wall rack. "Nobody's taking me anywhere." Hank stepped forward. "Keith, think about what you're doing. These aren't local cops you can intimidate. These are orbital defense specialists. I don't care if they're aliens from Mars," Keith snarled, pumping the shotgun. "This is our property." Outside, the minute was up. Jack raised the megaphone again. "Your time is up. We're coming in." He signaled to the remaining 6 soldiers. "Team 1 with me. Standard entry procedure. Remember, non-lethal force only." The soldiers moved to the main gate. One of them placed a small device against the lock, which sparked briefly before the gate swung open. Inside the main building, the bikers watched through the windows as the soldiers entered the compound. Their movements were precise and coordinated, like nothing the bikers had seen before. "They move like machines," Pete whispered. "Last chance," Hank said to Keith. "Put down the gun and surrender. Those soldiers out there are trained to fight, in zero gravity. You think a shotgun is going to stop them?" Keith's hands were shaking now, but pride kept him from backing down. "I'm not going to jail for punching some old man who disrespected me." "Then you're a fool," Hank said, stepping away from Keith. He turned to the other bikers. "Anyone with sense should walk out that door right now with your hands up." Several bikers looked at each other, then at Keith, then back at Hank. One by one, 5 of them moved toward the door. "Traitors!" Keith shouted. "You walk out that door, don't ever come back." Outside, Jack watched as the door to the main building opened and 5 bikers emerged with their hands raised. "Colonel Miller," one of them called out. "We're cooperating, the rest are still inside and Keith has a shotgun." Jack signaled to 2 of his soldiers, who moved forward to secure the surrendering bikers. He lifted his communication device. Captain Rodriguez? Status on the rear of the compound? Secured, sir. We've detained 3 who were trying to escape. On motorcycles. Good work. Maintain position. Jack turned to the remaining 4 soldiers of Team 1. Let's finish this. They approached the main building cautiously. Jack stopped about 20 feet from the front door. Keith Dawson, he called out. This doesn't need to get worse. Come out unarmed and you'll be treated fairly. Inside, Keith paced frantically. Most of his men had either surrendered or were looking for ways to distance themselves from him. Only Pete and 2 others stood with him. They're going to break down that door any second, Pete said nervously. Keith's mind raced. He hadn't expected this kind of response to what he saw as a minor incident. How was he supposed to know the old man had a son in the military? Maybe we should give up, one of the remaining bikers suggested. This isn't worth dying over. Nobody's dying, Keith snapped, though his confidence was slipping. They're bluffing. They can't use military force against civilians. Hank laughed bitterly. You still don't get it. They're not here as military. They're here as the son and friends of the man you assaulted, and they've done everything by the book. Citizen's arrest for an assault that had multiple witnesses. Outside, Jack saw movement at one of the windows. They're panicking in there, he observed. He turned to Greg. Let's show them we're serious. Disable their power. Greg nodded and tapped his tablet. One of the drones flew to the electrical box mounted on the side of the building. It emitted a brief pulse and all the lights in the compound went out. Inside, the bikers froze as darkness enveloped them. What the hell? Keith whispered. A moment later, bright floodlights blazed through every window, temporarily blinding everyone inside. The lights were mounted on the soldiers' gear, turning night into day. This is your final warning. Jack's voice came through the open windows, amplified and clear. The compound is surrounded. Your power is cut. Local authorities are on their way. There is no escape. In that moment, as he squinted against the harsh light, Keith Dawson realized he had made a terrible mistake. One punch thrown in anger at an old man had brought down the full might of a force he couldn't begin to comprehend. And, still, Colonel Jack Miller waited patiently outside, giving Keith one last chance to do the right thing. Keith Dawson stood in the darkened room, squinting against the bright light shining through the windows. The shotgun in his hands felt heavier by the second. This is crazy, he muttered. All this for punching an old man? Hank, who had backed away from Keith, shook his head. No. All this because you punched the wrong old man. Pete, Keith's right-hand man, placed a hand on his shoulder. Keith, it's over. Those aren't regular soldiers out there. Look at their gear. I've never seen anything like it. Keith's shoulders slumped. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. He lowered the shotgun slowly. What do I do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Put the gun down and walk out with your hands up, Hank said firmly. It's your only option now. After a long moment, Keith placed the shotgun on a nearby table. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door, his hands raised above his head. Outside, Jack Miller saw the door open. He signaled his team to hold position as Keith Dawson emerged from the building. The biker's face was pale in the harsh light from the soldiers' equipment. That's far enough, Jack called out when Keith was about 10 feet from the building. On your knees, hands behind your head. Keith complied, dropping to his knees on the dirt. 2 soldiers moved forward swiftly, securing his hands with zip ties. They patted him down for weapons before bringing him to where Jack stood. Jack studied the man who had punched his father. Keith was large and muscular, with tattoos covering his arms and neck. But now, surrounded by orbital defense specialists in advanced combat gear, he looked small and afraid. Keith Dawson, Jack said calmly, you're being detained for the assault of Frank Miller, a civilian and veteran of the United States Marine Corps. Keith looked up at Jack, meeting his eyes. I didn't know who he was. Would it have mattered? Jack asked. Would you have acted differently if you knew he was my father? Keith swallowed hard. Yes. But not because it was wrong to assault an 85-year-old man, Jack noted. Only because you would have feared the consequences. Keith had no answer to that. Jack turned away from him and surveyed the compound. The rest of the bikers were being brought out of the building by his team. Captain Rodriguez approached with a report. "Compound is secure, sir. All subjects accounted for. No injuries, on either side." "Good work, Captain," Jack said with a nod. He checked his watch. "Local authorities should be here any minute." As if on cue, 2 sheriff's vehicles pulled up outside the gate. Sheriff Dan Bailey stepped out, taking in the scene with wide eyes. It wasn't every day he saw military-grade equipment and soldiers in his county. "Colonel Miller," he said, approaching Jack, "got your message about making a citizen's arrest. Looks like you have things well in hand." Jack nodded. "Sheriff Bailey, thank you for coming. We're turning these men over to your custody. They assaulted my father at the Sunrise Diner this morning. Multiple witnesses, including the diner staff." Sheriff Bailey looked at the captured bikers, his gaze lingering on Keith. "Been wanting to clean this nest out for a while. Never had enough evidence to stick." Jack gestured to Lieutenant Porter, who stepped forward with his tablet. "We've taken statements from the witnesses and compiled them here, along with video from the diner's security camera. Should be everything you need for charges to stick this time." The sheriff took the tablet, eyebrows raised. "Well, that's mighty thorough of you, Colonel." "I believe in being prepared," Jack replied. As the bikers were loaded into sheriff's vehicles and additional police cars that had arrived, Jack pulled Sheriff Bailey aside. "One moment, Sheriff. I'd like a word with Mr. Dawson before you take him." The sheriff nodded. "Of course." Jack walked over to where Keith was waiting to be placed in a patrol car. The biker looked up as Jack approached. "Stand him up," Jack told the deputy who was guarding Keith. The deputy helped Keith to his feet. Jack stood directly in front of him, their eyes level. "I could have done much worse to you," Jack said quietly, so only Keith could hear. "But that's not what my father taught me about being a man." Then, with controlled precision, Jack delivered a single punch to Keith's jaw. The blow was calculated. Hard enough to hurt, not hard enough to cause serious damage. Keith staggered, but remained standing. "That's for my father," Jack said. "Now we're even." Keith worked his jaw, which was already beginning to swell. He looked at Jack with a mix of fear and confusion. "That's it? After all this, just one punch?" "The difference between you and me," Jack replied, "is that I could do much worse, but I choose not to. That's what my father taught me about power and restraint." As Keith was led away to the patrol car, Jack turned to his team. "Mission accomplished. Let's pack up and head back to the hospital." 20 minutes later, Jack walked into his father's hospital room. Frank was sitting up in bed looking much better than before. Major Wright was sitting beside him, the two engaged in animated conversation. And then the entire alien delegation refused to speak to anyone except the translator's pet cat, Frank was saying as Jack entered. "Strangest diplomatic mission I've ever been on." Samantha was laughing. She looked up as Jack approached. "Sir, mission successful?" "Completely," Jack confirmed. "All subjects in custody, no injuries on either side." Frank studied his son's face. "You didn't rough him up too much, did you?" "Just gave him something to remember you by," Jack said with a small smile. "Nothing he won't recover from." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good. Excessive force is rarely necessary when you have overwhelming advantage." "I learned from the best," Jack said, sitting on the edge of his father's bed. The doctor entered the room, reviewing Frank's chart. "Mr. Miller, your x-rays came back clear. No fractures in your hip, just some bruising. I'd like to keep you overnight for observation given your age, but you should be able to go home tomorrow." Frank frowned. "Is that really necessary?" "I feel fine." Jack placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, just stay the night. For me." Frank sighed. "Fine. But only because asking you to bring down that fancy ship again tomorrow seems wasteful of taxpayer resources." Jack laughed. Then he grew serious. "I have to get back to the platform soon. We're tracking a signal from Neptune that needs my attention." "Duty calls," Frank said with understanding. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." "I know you will." "You always are." Jack stood. "But I'm leaving Major Wright here to keep you company until you're discharged tomorrow. She'll make sure you get home safely." Samantha smiled. It would be my honor, sir. Your father was just telling me about his diplomatic missions after Vietnam. Frank waved a hand. Just old war stories. Nothing special. Every story is special when it comes from someone who's lived a life worth talking about, Samantha replied. Later, that evening as the Falcon dropship lifted off from the hospital helipad, Jack thought about the day's events. What had begun as a simple assault had turned into something more, a reminder of the bonds that connected him to his father, and the lessons that had shaped him as a man and as a soldier. In orbit above Earth, the Liberty Shield platform continued, its silent vigil, watching over humanity's home. And in a small county jail, Keith Dawson sat in a cell, rubbing his jaw and reflecting on the high cost of punching an 85-year-old veteran whose son commanded the stars.